it went from being primarily agricultural and feudal through a variety of manufacturing incarnations, such as the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and developed various approaches to trading with foreigners. This gave rise to a rich merchant class, producing cycles in which big wealth gaps developed followed by uprisings in which their wealth was seized. Since China has always been an intelligent and industrious society, numerous technological inventions moved its economy forward. Private entrepreneurial businesses also arose at different times in China's history, producing cycles in which wealth disparities grew, until governments expropriated and redistributed wealth in countless ways. China experienced debt cycles like those described in Chapter 3 as well, which took place for the same reasons. There were stable periods within these big debt cycles when debt growth wasn't excessive, bubble periods when it was, crisis periods when there wasn't enough money to service debt, and inflationary periods when money was printed to alleviate the debt crises. It's interesting to note that while the most powerful empires had global reserve currencies, this has not been true for China's most powerful dynasties. That is because, in the years prior to frequent oceanic travel, there was no such thing as a global reserve currency, and throughout its history, China never became such an extensive empire that a large portion of the world wanted to transact with and hold its promissory notes as storeholds of wealth. China never established a financial center rivaling those in Europe, and it was much less commercial. While China was ahead in financial market development in the Song dynasty, by the 1600s financial capital market developments in China were far behind those in Europe. Culturally, being commercial was not held in high regard by China's leaders, so there was less development of the commercial legal system and the financial markets. Because of that lesser commercial development and its more isolationist policies, China generally fell behind Europe in terms of innovation, which we will discuss later. Further, China's support for private commerce and financial markets was inconsistent, stronger in the Song and Tang periods and then more hostile in the Ming and Qing, when global trade empires were being established. As a result, the social and legal structures were less conducive to capital accumulation and investment. Also, the state overall was less willing and able to invest in strategic industries or push innovation. Confucian ideology probably played a role in this, as merchants' businesspeople were of lower status compared to scholars, a viewpoint that strengthened as more conservative strains of Confucianism gained sway in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Debt grew dramatically during the civil unrest and wars of the 1920s and 30s, which led to the classic cycle in which promises to deliver money far exceed capacities to do so. This caused widespread defaults, which classically led to the abandonment of the metal standard and the outlawing of metal coins and private ownership of silver. As previously explained, currencies are used for 1, domestic transactions, which the government has a monopoly in controlling, and 2, international transactions, in which case the currencies must be of real value or they won't be accepted. The test of the real value of a currency is whether it is actively used and traded at the same exchange rate internationally as domestically. When there are capital controls that prevent the free exchange of a domestic currency internationally, that currency is more susceptible to being devalued. By ion reserve currencies have no such controls. So, as a principle, when you see capital controls being put on a currency, especially when there is a big domestic debt problem, run from that currency. China had 2 currencies in the 1930s, a paper one for domestic transactions, and a gold one for international payments. The paper one was printed abundantly and frequently devalued. After the turbulence of World War II and the Chinese Civil War, in December 1948, the RST renminbi was issued as a currency, and it was kept in limited supply to end the hyperinflation. In 1955, a second issuance of renminbi was made, and in 1962 a third. From 1955 to 1971 the exchange rate was XCD at 2.46 to the US dollar. Then there was another round of high inflation in the 1970s and 80s, which was caused by the global devaluation of money against gold in 1971, global inflationary pressures, China phasing out its price controls, easy credit, and a lack of spending controls among state-owned enterprises. In 2005, the peg to the dollar was ended. The next chart shows Chinese inflation rates going back to 1750, including the periods of hyperinflation. The era of relatively stable inflation early on was largely the result of China using metals as money, which were valued by weight. When the Qing dynasty broke down, provinces declared independence and issued their own silver and copper coins, which were also valued by their weights. This is why there were not exceptionally high levels of inflation, even during this terrible period. The following charts show the value of Chinese currency in dollar and gold terms since 1920, plus the inflation and growth rates over that period. As you can see, there were two major periods of devaluation, the RST when the new exchange rate was set up in 1948, and between 1980 and the 1990s when there was a series of devaluations aimed to support exporters and manage current account deficits, which caused very high inflation. As shown, growth was relatively fast and erratic until around 1978, then fast and much less erratic until the recent brief plunge due to the COVID-19 pandemic. While most Chinese have a strong desire to save and an appropriate sense of risk that innately drives them to store their wealth in safe liquid assets and tangible assets, some investors have limited experiences with riskier assets such as equities and risky debt, and so can be naive, though they are learning very fast. But when it comes to Chinese policymakers' understanding of money, credit, monetary policy, scalp policy, and how to restructure bad debts, I have found them to have the same kinds of deep and timeless perspectives that they have for the rest of their history. From 1800 until now. I'll begin with a brief overview of the period between 1800 and the foundation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, examine the Mao period a bit more closely. Then take a deeper look at the period spanning the rise of Deng Xiaoping and the advent of Xi Jinping until now. Then, in the next chapter, we will look at U.S.-China relations. The decline from 1800 until 1949. China's post-1800 decline began when the last Chinese royal dynasty became decadent and weak at the same time that the British and some other Western countries became strong, which led British and other capitalist colonialists to increasingly take control of China economically. Meanwhile, China's financial and monetary system broke down under the burden of debts that couldn't be paid and the printing of money that caused a collapse in its value, while there were massive domestic rebellions and civil wars. That severe big cycle decline, in which all the major strengths were in mutually reinforcing free falls, continued from around 1840 until 1949. The end of World War II in 1945 led to the repatriation of most foreigners in China and a civil war to determine how the wealth and power would be divided, i.e., a war between the communists and the capitalists on the Chinese mainland. This long period of decline was a classic case of the archetypical big cycle, and it was followed by an equally classic case of a big cycle upswing, in which a new leader wins control, consolidates power, and begins building the basic structures that are passed on to succeeding generations, who build on each other's accomplishments. As discussed in previous chapters, the early 1800s was the time of Britain's rise and expansion across the globe, which brought the rising British Empire into greater contact with China. The British East India Company wanted tea, silk, and porcelain from China because it was extremely lucrative to sell back home. However, the British didn't have anything that the Chinese wanted to trade for, so they had to pay for these goods in silver, which was a global money at the time. When the British began to run out of silver, they smuggled opium into China from India, which they sold for silver, which they then used to pay for Chinese goods. The Chinese fought to stop those sales, which led to the First Opium War, in which the technologically superior British Navy defeated the Chinese in 1839-42. Leading Britain to impose a treaty that gave the British Hong Kong and opened up a number of Chinese ports, most notably Shanghai, to traders from Britain, which eventually led to the loss of large parts of northern China to Russia and Japan and the loss of what we now call Taiwan to Japan. The Qing government borrowed heavily from foreigners to GHT internal rebellions. Reparations, especially after the Boxer Rebellion, also created huge liabilities. When the rebellion failed, the victorious foreign powers demanded the equivalent of about 18,000 tons of silver, which was structured around a 40-year debt that was guaranteed by the Tari income on the ports they controlled. The Qing government, starved of financial resources, faced many uprisings over the couple decades following. the Opium Wars and spent down their savings to Nance guiding them. The combination of 1. Not having strong leadership, 2. Not having sound Nances, 3. Having internal rebellions that undermined productivity and were costly in money and lives, 4. Guiding foreigners, which was costly Nancy ally and in lives. And 5. Experiencing some big disruptive acts of nature produced the mutually and self-reinforcing decline known as the century of humiliation. It is easy to see the important role that period has played in shaping Chinese leaders' perspectives. Example: why Mao saw capitalism as a system in which companies pursued pro-TS through imperialism, enriching the greedy elites while exploiting workers. Mao's view of capitalism differs from my own because his experience with it was so different, though both of our views of it are true. Capitalism has provided me and most others I know, including immigrants from all over the world, with enormous opportunities. The America I came of age in was the land of opportunity, in which one could learn, contribute, and be rewarded fairly and without boundaries. This experience of seeing through another's eyes was another reminder for me of how important radical open-mindedness and thoughtful disagreement are to ding out what is true. It led me to study Marxism a bit, so I could understand why it made sense to Mao and others as a philosophy. My inclination up until then was to think of it as at best impractical and at worst a potentially evil threat, yet I was ignorant about what Marx had actually said. Enter Marxism-Leninism. Before I examined it for myself, I'd assumed that Marxism-Leninism was a dysfunctional system in which resources were theoretically distributed, from each according to his abilities, to each according his needs, that failed to produce much because of its lack of incentives to be inventive and escient. I didn't appreciate that Marx was a brilliant man who came up with some good theories and some seemingly bad ones that he would probably agree were not adequately tested and reneged by the evolutionary system he espoused. Now I wonder how Marx, a very practical man who believed that philosophies should only be judged by the successes and failures they produce, would have diagnosed communism's near total and universal failure and changed his thinking as a result. Marx's most important theory system is called dialectical materialism. Dialectical refers to how opposites interact to produce change, and materialism means that everything has a material existence that interacts with other things in a mechanical way. In a nutshell, dialectical materialism is a system for producing change by observing and enuncing the contradictions of opposites that produce struggles that, when resolved, produce progress. Marx meant it to apply to everything. The con-ICT and struggle between the classes that is manifest in the con-ICT between capitalism and communism is just one of many such examples. Much of that sounds right to me. Though I'm no expert on Marxism, the process of dialectical materialism is similar to the process that I discovered for myself and explained in my book Principles, Life and Work, in which I struggle with con-ICT, re-ECT on them, write down the principles I derive from them, and then improve them, and do that over and over again, in a never-ending, evolutionary way that I describe as looping. In other words, I believe, and it sounds like Marx believed, that learning and evolving from con-ICTs and mistakes is the best approach. It is also my opinion that capitalism, an incentive system that rewards the people who are most inventive and productive, and that has capital markets that reward good capital allocation decisions and penalizes bad ones, will lead to A. more productivity over the long run, B. big wealth differences, and C. capital markets that become overextended and then break down. When there is a capital market economic breakdown at the same time that there are big wealth and values disparities, that is likely to lead to some form of revolution. Such revolutions can end harmoniously and productively, but most are preceded by great con-ICT and destruction. So, thus far the way Marx appeared to see things and the way I see things aren't radically different, though what we would choose and what we would think should be done are probably radically different. If you asked me, whether I'd rather have what capitalism has delivered or what communism delivered, and B. if I think the capitalist path we have now is more logical than the communist path we have seen, I'd choose capitalism as my answer to both. On the other hand, if you asked me if both the capitalist and the communist systems need to be reformed to make the pie grow more effectively and to be distributed more fairly, and B. if Marx's dialectical materialism approach to evolving and my 5-step process to evolving are broadly similar, and the best ways of evolving well, I would say yes to both questions. Also, as far as the wealth gap goes, I share the view that it has been a big issue throughout history that can threaten all systems. I too believe that conflicts produce struggle and that working through struggle produces progress. I consider the conflicts between the classes to be among the main drivers of the rise and decline of empires, and hence the progress of history, with those drivers being the three big cycles: money and credit, internal order disorder, and external order disorder, discussed earlier in this book. All of those cycles across the leading countries were in their decline ICT phases between 1930 and 1945, which led to revolutions and wars in China and all over the world. But as always happens, the forces of decline ran their course and new domestic and world orders began. More specifically, the external war ended in 1945 and foreign forces left most of mainland China. China's communists and capitalists then fought an internal war that ended in 1949, which led to a new domestic order, which was communism under Mao. Put yourself in Mao's position during the 1949 period. Imagine him reading what Marx wrote, and think about his actions during that period and in the post-1949 period. It makes sense that Mao was a Marxist and held the established Confucian approach to harmony in disdain. Democracy as we know it doesn't have any roots in China. Legalism, with its autocratic approach, does. Capitalism, on the other hand, is growing and becoming much more deeply rooted today. Lenin built on what Marx said to create a two-step process for building the state, in which there is at RST a vanguard of workers though, democratic centralism, which eventually leads to a higher communist state in which there is common ownership of the means of production, social and economic equality, and general prosperity. Mao liked the Marxist-Leninist approach, in which the achievement of the communist ideal came at the end of a very long evolutionary process. Deng Xiaoping reiterated this view in an interview with 60 Minutes in 1986, in which he said that the capitalism he was adopting and communism were not incompatible. According to Marxism, he said, communist society is based on material abundance. Only when there is material abundance can the principle of a communist society, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, be applied. Socialism is the RST stage of communism. Maybe that's true and maybe it's not. Time will tell. To me, thus far capitalism, in China or anywhere else, is winning the competition. However, there can be no question that the Chinese mix of communism and capitalism has produced remarkable economic results over the last 40 years. In the next section I will very briefly summarize what happened between 1949 and now. Then I will delve into each of its phases in greater detail. The rise from 1949 until now. Though it's a bit of an oversimplification, we can think of China's evolution from 1949 until now as occurring in three phases. 1. The Mao phase, from 1949 to 1976. 2. The Deng and Deng's successors phase, from 1978 to 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power. 3. The Xi Jinping phase from 2012 until now. Each phase moved China along the arc of its long-term development, building on its earlier accomplishments. In brief, events transpired as follows. From 1949 until he died in 1976, Mao consolidated power, built China's foundation of institutions, governance, and infrastructure, and ruled China as a communist emperor. Isolated from the rest of the world, China followed a strict communist system in which the government owned everything and maintained tight bureaucratic controls. Immediately following the deaths of Mao and Zhou Enlai, there was a power struggle in 1976-78 between the Gang of Four hardliners and the reformists. Deng Xiaoping and the reformists emerged victorious in 1978, leading to the second phase. Deng and his ministers ran China directly or indirectly until his death in 1997. During this phase, China moved to a more collective leadership model, opened up to the outside world, introduced and developed market capitalist practices, and became much stronger nationally and more powerful in other ways that didn't appear threatening to the United States or to other countries. To enhance what was then viewed as a symbiotic relationship in which the U.S. bought items that were attractively priced from China, China lent Americans money. As a result, the U.S. acquired U.S. dollar-denominated debt liabilities and the Chinese acquired dollar-denominated assets. After Deng's death, his successors Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao continued in the same direction, so China's wealth and power grew in fundamentally sound ways that did not appear threatening to the U.S. In 2008, the global financial crisis came along, which led to greater tensions over wealth in the United States and other developed countries, increased resentment at the idea of manufacturing jobs to China, and increased debt-enhanced growth in all countries, including China. Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, presiding over a richer, more powerful China that was becoming overly indebted, too corrupt, and increasingly at odds with the United States. He accelerated economic reforms, took on the challenge of trying to contain debt growth while aggressively reforming the economy, supported the building of leading technologies, and took an increasingly global stance. He also became more proactive in reducing China's gaps in education and its income inequality, in protecting the environment, and in consolidating political control. As China's powers grew and Xi's bold objectives became more apparent, tensions with the U.S. rose, especially after Donald Trump was elected president. China's position vis-a-vis the U.S. became one of a rapidly strengthening power, challenging the dominant one. Now let's take a closer look. Phase 1: Building the Foundation. Mao and the Communists won the Civil War and started the People's Republic of China in 1949 and quickly consolidated power. Mao became the de facto emperor, and Zhou Enlai his prime minister. Domestically, the new government quickly repaired transportation and communications infrastructure and nationalized the banking system under the aegis of the new central bank, the People's Bank of China. To bring down inflation, it tightened credit and stabilized the value of the currency. The government also nationalized most businesses and redistributed agricultural land from large landowners to the peasants, who farmed the land. Whether one worked or not, one received basic pay. There was no merit-based pay. The protections that these guaranteed basic incomes and benefits provided everyone were collectively called the Iron Rice Bowl. These changes created a stable economy but little motivation. Internationally, China was isolationist, though it wasn't long before the new government found itself in a war. As explained in the last chapter, in 1945 the New World Order divided the world into two main ideological camps: the democratic capitalists led by the United States and the autocratic communists led by the Soviet Union, with a third group of countries that were not committed to either side. Many of these non-aligned countries had until recently been colonies, most notably under the declining British Empire. China was clearly in the Soviet-led camp. On February 14, 1950, Mao and Stalin signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance to cooperate and come to each other's aid militarily. At the end of World War II, Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, with the Russians controlling the north and the Americans the south. In June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The Chinese stayed out of the guiding initially, as they were preoccupied with their own challenges and didn't want to be drawn into a war. In conjunction with the United Nations, the United States responded by bringing its forces into the guiding, taking the war into North Korea, which borders China. The Chinese viewed this as a threat, especially since U.S. General Douglas MacArthur made it clear that he would attack China. Though the Soviets and the Chinese had a pact to support each other, Stalin didn't want to go to war with the United States, so he didn't provide China with the military support it expected. Though the Chinese were ill-prepared for war against a much greater American power, the Chinese entered the war, pushing the American and UN troops back to the previously established border. This was Mao's RST Great Challenge, and it is considered a great victory by the Chinese. Between the PRC's founding in 1949 and Mao's death in 1976, the Chinese economy grew rather quickly, at an average annual rate of about 6%, with an average annual inflation rate of around 1–2%, accumulating around $4 billion in foreign exchange reserves. This represented a modest improvement, but China remained poor. And there was a lot of volatility along the way. Specifically, between 1952 and 1957, with the help of the Soviets, industrial production grew at 19% a year, national income grew at 9% a year, and agricultural production grew by 4% a year. The Chinese government built industrial facilities and imported lots of equipment from the Soviets. It also reformed its agricultural practices and methods by creating cooperatives to achieve economies of scale by having farmers work together. These were highly productive years. However, after Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev came to power, criticized Stalin and his policies, and alienated Mao, which led to these Chinese and Soviet leaders openly criticizing each other, which began a period of reduced Soviet support. Around 1960, the Soviet Union shifted from being an ally to being an enemy and withdrew economic support. From 1958 through 1962, due to a drought, economic mismanagement from the top-down mandated attempt to become an industrial power called the Great Leap Forward, and reduced Soviet economic support, the economy contracted by 25% and an estimated 40 million people died of famine. Estimates suggest that over that period industrial output fell by 19% in aggregate, with a fall of around 36% from the 1959 peak. Historians agree that it was a terrible period, though there is some disagreement about how much it was terrible because of terrible management by Mao versus other causes. Between 1963 and 1966, the economy recovered and went to new highs. But then came the Cultural Revolution. As is classic in all cycles, challenges to Mao's leadership and ideology arose. Since most Chinese emperors were taken down by insiders, this risk had to be on Mao's mind. So from 1966 until 1976, he fostered a political revolution, called the Cultural Revolution, to purify class ranks and reinforce Mao Zedong thought. Mao won the political ideological battle, purging his rival Lin Biao, who died in a plane crash during a botched coup he was accused of organizing, and Mao Zedong thought was written into the constitution. The cost of Mao's triumph was appalling. The Cultural Revolution curtailed education and damaged or cost countless lives and dealt a huge blow to the Chinese economy. By the early 1970s, the situation had begun to stabilize under the operational leadership of Premier Zhou Enlai. In 1969, there were clashes between Chinese and Russian troops along the border. 1971 was a year of great change in China. The Cultural Revolution was producing turmoil and Mao's health was declining. That contributed to Zhou Enlai playing an increasing leadership role from the background, which led to him being elected vice chairman of the Communist Party in 1973, putting him in the position of appearing to be Mao's successor. Also in 1971, China was threatened by the Soviet Union, which was militarily much more powerful and shared a 2,500-mile border with China, leading to increasing border threats. In 1975, after the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, which shares a 900-mile border with southern China, Russia built an alliance with Vietnam and moved in troops and arms. Mao had a geopolitical principle to identify the main enemy, neutralize the enemy's allies, and draw them away from the enemy. Mao identified the Soviet Union as China's main enemy and recognized that the Soviets were in a war with the United States that hadn't yet turned hot but could. That led him to make the strategic move of approaching the U.S. Henry Kissinger quoted Chinese Oz Xiaos as saying, "The last thing the U.S. imperialists are willing to see is a victory by Soviet revisionists in a Sino-Soviet war, as this would to build up a big empire more powerful than the American empire in resources and manpower." I also know that Zhou Enlai, a reformist, had wanted to build a strategic relationship with the United States for decades because a close Chinese friend of mine, Ji Chaozhu, who was Zhou Enlai's interpreter for 17 years and interpreted in the RST Kissinger-Zhou Enlai talks, told me that that was the case. China wanted to open a relationship with the United States to neutralize the Russian threat and to enhance its geopolitical and economic position. Because in 1971 it was especially clear that it was in the interests of China and the United States to build a relationship, they both made overtures to establish relations. In July 1971, Kissinger, and then in February 1972 President Richard Nixon, went to China, and in October 1971 the United Nations recognized the Mao-led Communist Chinese government and gave China a seat on the Security Council. During Nixon's visit, Nixon and Zhou Enlai signed an agreement, the Shanghai Communique, in which the U.S. stated that it acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. Despite those assurances, reunification with Taiwan still remains the most consistently contentious issue between China and the U.S. Following those moves of rapprochement, U.S. relations with China and trade and other exchanges began. Then, in January and September 1976, RST Zhou Enlai and then Mao died and Communist China faced its RST succession crisis. From 1976 to 1978, there was a GHT for power between the Gang of Four and the Reformists. The Reformists won, and Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader in 1978. Phase 2, Deng and his successors gained strength through economic reforms and opening up without creating threats to other countries. Deng Xiaoping was 74, with a wealth of experience under his belt. From 1978 until he died in 1997, his most important policies were conveyed in a single phrase: reform and opening up. Reform meant market reforms, using markets to help allocate resources and incentivize people, and opening up meant interacting with the outside world to learn, improve, and trade. Capitalism became a part of the communist mix. China was still extremely poor. Its per capita income was less than $200 a year. Deng knew these moves would make China and its allies stronger if they were not disrupted by the far stronger foreign powers who wanted China to remain weak. The key was to pursue them in ways that benefited and didn't threaten them. In 1979, he established full diplomatic relations with the U.S. Early on, Deng set out a 70-year plan to A, double incomes and ensure that the population would have enough food and clothing by the end of the 1980s, B, quadruple GDP per capita by the end of the 20th century, and C, increase per capita GDP to the levels of medium-level developed countries by 2050. He made it clear that China would achieve those goals by having a socialist market economy, which he also referred to as socialism with Chinese characteristics. He made that radical shift without criticizing Marxism-Leninism. Indeed, as noted earlier, he did not see the two systems as fundamentally at odds, but rather viewed them through the lens of dialectical materialism, as opposites that could be resolved, leading to progress along the long arc toward communism's ideal state. During his term, Deng also reformed the decision-making structure of government. More specifically, he moved its decision-making process from one that was dominated by a single leader to one in which the Politburo Standing Committee took votes when a consensus couldn't be reached. He also changed the system of choosing the standing members of the Politburo from one in which the Supreme Leader personally selected them to one in which candidates, generally quali-ed government officials, were chosen via consultation and negotiation with experienced party elders. To institutionalize his governing philosophy, Deng shaped the new Chinese constitution, which was adopted in 1982. This new constitution also made a number of changes to facilitate the economic reforms and open-door policies that Deng wanted. It established term limits for leaders and discouraged autocratic decision-making by formalizing his collective leadership democratic centralist policies. The new constitution also provided for greater freedom of religion, opinion, speech, and the press, to encourage the Chinese to seek truth from facts. These reforms enabled the RST orderly transition of power to the next generation Politburo Standing Committee, led by Jiang Zemin, and then on to Hu Jintao, with their transitions following the prescribed 2-year terms. Each successive leadership team kept to Deng's basic path of making China richer and more powerful by making its economy more market-driven capitalist, and by increasing China's trade with and learning from other countries. With those in other countries feeling more excited than threatened by their interactions and trade with China. Regaining territories it lost during its century of humiliation was also a very important long-term goal. In 1984, after a lot of haggling with the UK, it was agreed that Hong Kong would return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, with a one country, two systems approach. Then in 1986, China reached an agreement with Portugal to obtain Macau's return to Chinese sovereignty in 1999. In 1984, I had my RST direct contact with China. I visited China at the invitation of the China International Trust Investment Corporation, China's only window company, whose leaders had asked me to help them understand how world financial markets work. The company had been set up as an extension of Deng's reform and opening up policies and was run by Rong Yiren, an old Chinese capitalist who had chosen to stay in China even after his family's business was nationalized. China was very poor and backward then. However, it was immediately clear to me that its people were smart and civilized, and its poverty was widely shared. In this regard, it wasn't like most other undeveloped countries I'd been to, where the poor seemed to live in a different century. China's backwardness stemmed from a general lack of access to what was available in the outside world and from its demotivating system. For example, I gave out $10 calculators as gifts, and even the highest-ranking people thought they were miraculous devices. At the time, all businesses were government-owned and bureaucratic. The Chinese couldn't choose their jobs, never mind their careers, and received no financial incentives for working well. There was no private ownership of property, such as one's home, and there was no contact with what the world had to offer in terms of best practices and products. Because it was clear to me that the closed door was the reason for China's poverty, I believed that its removal would naturally equalize its standards of living with the developed world, just as unconstrained water naturally seeks the same level. It was easy to visualize that happening. I remember being on the 10th floor of CITIC's chocolate building to give a lecture. I pointed out the window at the two-story hutongs below us and told my audience that it would not be long before they would be gone and skyscrapers would stand in their place. "You don't know China," they said in disbelief. I told them that they did not know the power of the economic arbitrages that would occur as a result of opening up. While the opening up created a great natural opportunity, the Chinese made the most of it and performed even beyond my highest expectations. They did that by making and implementing Deng's reforms, supported by uniquely Chinese cultural nuances. The expressed goal that I heard a lot of in those early days of reform was to break the iron rice bowl, which was to no longer provide demotivating guaranteed employment and ensured basic benefits and replace them with more incentive-based compensation. Globalization also helped a lot. The world wanted to include China. Deng was an eager learner, and he directed his policy makers to learn from outsiders in the same way that he did. He especially relied on Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore and other leaders of the culturally aligned Asian Tiger economies for advice. I remember a dinner with the head of China's MOFTEC, in which he rattled out details about the operations of Singapore's airport, how Singapore achieved such great results, and how China was going to implement those practices itself. Many years later I had the opportunity to host Lee Kuan Yew at my house, along with some other esteemed guests. We asked him to share his thoughts about leaders of the present and past. We were eager to get his perspective because he had known most of them over the last 50 years and was one of the greats himself. Without hesitating, he said that Deng was the greatest leader of the 20th century. Why? Because he was smart and wise and open-minded, he was extremely practical, and he delivered great results for his country of 1 billion people. While Deng formally stepped down from the Politburo's Standing Committee in 1987, he remained the de facto leader of China, which continued to open up and become more capitalist at a breakneck pace. I played a small part in its evolution over the years. In 1989, my CITIC friend Wang Li introduced me to the group of people who, along with her, had been designated to create the organization that would set up the RST stock markets in the new China. They had been appointed by 7 companies at the request of the visionary economic reformer and historian Wang Qishan. China was still very poor, and CXOC was in a dingy hotel because the group lacked adequate funding. Still, they had what mattered most, a clear mission to create big changes, smart people of good character, open-mindedness to allow rapid learning, and determination to achieve their goals. This was not a job to them, it was a noble mission to improve their country. I was thrilled to help them. And over the decades that followed, I saw how they and many others built the Chinese financial markets to become among the largest in the world. Then, a shock happened that led everyone to question just about everything. In 1989, a movement to democratize China grew into the demonstrations that led to the crackdown known as the Tiananmen Square incident. The leadership was split on how to handle the movement. Deng made the Daning choice, which was to sideline the liberal forces and go ahead with the conservatives' crackdown. Most Chinese people I spoke with at the time were worried that China would slip back into its old Mao Gangafor-type ways. A very close friend from CITIC, Madame Gu, whose brother was China's Minister of Defense, happened to be staying with my family at the time, so I saw events unfold through her eyes as well as through the eyes of other Chinese friends. Madame Gu had been an idealistic follower of Mao in the early years after liberation. When the Cultural Revolution came along, she lost her husband to persecution and was shunned by friends. She got past that terrible experience to work on behalf of the country she loved and rose to a senior job at CITIC. She cried at the prospect of a return to those terrible old days. Tiananmen Square significantly set back most countries' relationships with China, but it didn't keep Deng and his government from continuing their reforms. Over time, most of my Chinese friends who were heartbroken about the crackdown came to believe that the government had made the right move because their greatest fear was revolutionary disorder. Over the next decade, the economy continued its strong growth, and relations and trade with the West became better than ever. Globalization, which helped China immensely, can be said to have begun in 1995 with the formation of the World Trade Organization. China joined the WTO in 2001, and its position in world trade soared. That year, the United States had more trade than China with 80% of WTO member countries. Now China is a larger trading partner than the United States for about 70% of those countries. During this period of globalization, a symbiotic relationship developed between China and the US in which the Chinese manufactured consumer goods in an extremely cost-effective way and loaned the US money to buy them. It was a hell of a buy now, pay later deal for the Americans, and the Chinese liked it because they built their savings in the world's reserve currency. It struck me as odd that the Chinese, who were earning about a 40th of Americans on average, would be lending money to Americans, since rich people are in a better position to lend than poor ones. To me, it was a shocking reaction of how deeply Americans were willing to get into debt to finance their overconsumption, and how much more the Chinese valued saving. It was also a reaction of how emerging countries that want to save in the bonds debt of the leading reserve currency countries can lead those countries to become over-indebted. In 1992, China's triangular debt crisis came to a head. These were debt and economic problems that arose from China's major government-owned banks lending to large, scient, and unprofitable state-owned enterprises with the implicit guarantee of the central government. Xu Rongji,